You'll step aside now. That's what my father said after I built his company into a $99 million empire. But I had already prepared for this betrayal. And what happened next, no one saw coming. I had finally succeeded in turning my father's business into a $99 million success after 8 arduous years of managing it. I gave Anderson and Company my all, revitalizing a company that had previously struggled to thrive. Then, during what should have been a celebratory family meal, everything changed. Calm and proud, my father gave me a smile. The words that struck me like a freight train then came out of his hand on my brother's shoulder. Your brother will now assume control. Despite feeling sick to my stomach, I maintained a straight expression. I had learned to conceal the tempest within myself through years of effort. Pretending that those remarks hadn't just destroyed 8 years of my life's work, I returned the smile. Congratulatory nods, glass clinking, and discussion filled the room. The purpose of the evening was to recognize what we had constructed. For what I had constructed. Then all of a sudden I was invisible. As a child, I had witnessed my father's battle to maintain Anderson and Company, a small logistics company that had barely survived its early years. He pushed for every contract, worked late, and missed family holidays. I had to struggle for permission to assist when I was 26 and barely out of business school. But after I took over, I changed everything. I transformed that little local company into a major force in the country. I introduced state-of-the-art technology, secured multi-million-dollar contracts, and completely reorganized our business. None of it mattered though. Julian, my brother, who had never really taken an interest in the business, was now in charge. He had been chasing shortcuts and fast wins for the past 7 years, alternating between pathetic endeavors. He had little interest in logistics. He was never interested in building things. However, power did. He lowered his gaze, feigning humility as the praises and applause poured in his direction. However, I was aware. This was the moment he had been anticipating. The lovely son, at last prepared to take up the mantle, had done his job brilliantly. Furthermore, my father, who has always been a traditionalist, saw nothing wrong with his son taking over the family business. Ultimately, he believed that a daughter's contribution was fleeting. I was only ever a stand-in for the heir, no matter how hard I worked. They were unaware, however, that I had accomplished more than merely creating a business. I had earned my place in it. I had secretly secured every component of the foundation while they were mired in their antiquated notions. Every important client connection. Every strategic choice. Every growth project. Everything has my fingerprints on it. And they would see just what that meant in the morning. I didn't get much sleep that night. Every late night, difficult choice, every sacrifice I had made kept coming back to me. One thing was certain, though, my narrative wasn't over yet. It was only the start. I sacrificed everything for Anderson and Company, including birthdays missed, late nights, and friendships and relationships that were unable to withstand the strain of my ambition. Everything was invested in creating this company. My entire life was centered around that. They now expected me to simply move aside. They had misjudged me. I was in my home office by 4 a.m., with my computer's light filling the space. I swept my fingers over the keyboard. I retrieved executive agreements, shareholder documents, and contracts, everything I had covertly worked on over the years. I know this company better than anyone else. Not my dad. Not Julian, of course. Julian believed that everything would go smoothly and that by the following week, his title would be official and his name would be on the CEO's door. However, I was working behind the scenes on something far more significant, control, while Julian seemed to be concerned with logistics and my father was occupied with going to public events. I arrived at Anderson and Company's headquarters at 9 a.m., like I had done every morning for the previous 8 years. The same shiny floors, the same constant hum of typing and ringing phones. Today, however, felt different. This was more than just an office today. It was a battleground. There was silence in the reception area. Too silent. Already whispers had begun. My father made an announcement at supper and it quickly got out. When I walked by, a few workers turned away, uncertain about where to pledge their allegiance. Others avoided making eye contact and simply nodded courteously. I didn't slow down. My heels clicked on the marble floor as I walked tall. Never let them see you disturbed, I had learned long ago. I entered my office and silently closed the door. I had just 12 minutes before they showed there, eager to assert their new positions, Julian as the chosen heir, my father as the re-emerging founder. It was 12 minutes until their scheme failed. I sat down at my desk, turned on my computer, and took a deep breath. Confidential files that they had never bothered to view and agreements they believed were irrelevant were shown on the screen. However, they were important. The executive shareholders agreement was the only file at the top. I waited after opening it. The door was sharply knocked at precisely 9 in the morning. I didn't respond. Still, it opened. My father entered first, calm and authoritative. Julian trailed behind him, all decked up in a navy suit, looking arrogant, like a prince set to be crowned. My father's confidence came easily, as though he already thought he was entitled to the crown, but his was practiced. My father said, "Elena," in a stern yet courteous tone. "I presume you are aware of the change occurring today." "Change?" I leaned back in my chair and repeated. "Interesting word choice." "I am aware, yes." He nodded and replied, "Good," as though everything was proceeding as planned. "As the next CEO, Julian will take over. You will need to assist us with the handover. Before you formally step away, make sure he is completely informed." I arched an eyebrow. "Go away." He clenched his jaw. He disliked being asked questions. It was unfamiliar to him. "Elena," he replied in a chilly tone, "there is no question about this. The choice has been made." I gave a slow, composed, and aware smile. I responded softly, "I know that, Dad. The problem is that you lack the power to decide that." Julian shook his head and scoffed. "Come on, Elena. Avoid making this a conflict. We're attempting to take the simple route." I didn't respond to him. Rather, I grabbed the remote control off my desk and hit a button. The big wall-mounted screen sprang to life. The executive shareholders agreement appeared, strong and clear. The same one they had never read together. The same one that would completely upend their strategy. I started by saying, "I've been looking over an old executive shareholders agreement that was signed on September 22, 2013. My father, Richard Hart, Elena Hart, and Julian Hart signed the document." I saw my father's face was a little pale as I looked at him. I looked across at Julian. "Are you even familiar with this document?" I inquired. He shifted uneasily and folded his arms. "An agreement with shareholders," he surmised. I gave a nod. "Indeed. You know what it says too?" I tapped on a particular phrase. "This was made while the business was being restructured. It makes it very apparent that all majority shareholders must approve any significant decision, such as choosing a new CEO." My father and I looked at each other. "And I own 74% of the business, Dad." There was silence in the room. My dad's expression hardened. "That's not possible," Julian muttered and moved forward to have a better look. "Oh, it's definitely possible," I said coolly. "I was working on something else while you were occupied with your startup aspirations, and Dad was acting as the patriarch of the company. I was protecting myself." I bent closer. "Do you recall when you required capital for growth in 2014? For that investment, you provided me 22% of your shares. Then in 2016, you gave over an additional 14% as collateral throughout the court case. You didn't retract it. In addition to the 31% I already held, and now we are." My dad's jaw tightened. Panic made Julian's face go white. "That's bluffing," he yelled. I gave him another document without saying anything. "This is the latest legal filing with the state. Go ahead, verify it." Julian picked up the paper and quickly skimmed it. He lost all the color in his face. "You can't do this," he stumbled to describe it. "Dad, tell her she can't do this." My father, however, remained silent. He was aware that I had complied with the rules. I had just performed better in the game. Slowly, I got to my feet. When I said, "I'm not firing you, Julian, I wouldn't want to force you into the real job market. But from now on, you'll report to me. You'll work under my leadership. Otherwise," I turned toward the entrance. "You're free to leave." Julian silently begged for assistance as he glanced at our father. However, my father had no answer for the first time in his life. Since this was no longer his business, I owned it. There was a heavy silence in my office. Julian's knuckles remained white as he held onto the paper. My father was standing next to him, his face unreadable, but I could tell he was calculating and trying to find a way out. No one existed. Not because I was spiteful, but because I knew that loyalty is never assured when power is involved. I had prepared for this time. My father gave me an odd look for the first time in my life. Perhaps he didn't know me at all. With a bitter tone, Julian finally asked, "So that's it? You're just taking everything?" I laughed a little dryly. "Taking everything?" I took a step forward. "Julian, I created this business. I was the one who kept it afloat through every transaction, growth, and invention. You missed opportunities, but I made sure this business survived. I'm keeping what is already mine, so no, I'm not taking anything. Julian's face contorted in rage, but he was powerless to stop it. And he was aware that I was correct. Our father did the same. For years, he thought that his son would inherit what I had fought so hard to achieve, that the family name was more significant than skill. He was mistaken. And now he had to deal with the fallout. His voice was even but strained when he eventually stated, "You're making a mistake, Elena. Families should stick together. Do you really want to burn this bridge?" I didn't blink as I looked into his eyes. "Dad," I whispered quietly, "you burned this bridge the day you made decisions without me." He made a strong line with his lips. "Business is bigger than one person. We can find a solution that works for everyone." With a tiny bend of my head, I pretended to think. "I agree. That's why I'm offering you both a choice." I looked first at Julian. I said, "You can stay with the company in a composed and businesslike manner. You won't be CEO. You'll serve as an advisor. You'll have a solid salary but limited authority. And you will answer to me." Julian tensed but remained silent. It was an obvious message. The power had changed and it would not return. I didn't stop though. I continued. I answered, "Or you can walk away. I'll buy your shares at market value. Take the money, find a new venture, pour your energy into something else." My dad sneered. "You're acting like you hold all the cards." I smiled at him a little knowingly. "That's because I do." There was a heavy hush. I gave it some leeway. I wanted them to sit with that reality, to experience what it was like to be powerless, to understand that the rules had changed and they were no longer in charge. With a look of incredulity on his face, my father finally let out a breath and shook his head. He said, "I never thought you'd do this. Not to your relatives." I wasn't prepared for how hard his remarks affected me. "Not to your own relatives." I wanted to let him know that he initiated this and that he had decided to ignore me, use me as a stand-in or short-term solution. I didn't say it though, because it didn't matter in the end. The important thing was that I refused to let them take what I had created. Not right now. Never. Julian was the first to storm out. "Goodbye." I knew precisely what he was going to do next. He would spread the tale to our extended family, former acquaintances, and business associates in an attempt to portray himself as the victim of corporate treachery. Permit him. I didn't come here to gain their favor. To protect my future, I was here. My father lingered a moment longer, as though he thought I might reconsider. I didn't. And he nodded slowly when it was obvious that I wouldn't. "You've changed," he muttered. I looked him in the eye. "No, father. I just quit acting for the first time." Then he also went out. I let out a breath and sank back in my seat. I ought to have felt triumphant. I had won the battle for my spot. But I sensed something else instead. A silent pain. There had always been a tiny part of me that needed his approval. In the hopes that he would eventually notice me, I had spent years establishing myself. In actuality, though, he never had. And he was at a loss now. He no longer saw a daughter. He saw me for who I truly am, Anderson & Company's leader. I returned my attention to my PC. My attention changed. I had built this business for 8 years. I would now spend the next 8 hours making it impenetrable. Julian and my father had attempted to rob me of everything. Instead, they ended up losing everything. My office was quiet for the first time in more than 10 years. My father didn't call. Julian didn't send any passive-aggressive emails. Nothing but quiet. However, peace was not implied by silence. It was a call to war. I was aware that none of them would give up easy. My father refused to leave in silence. Persuaded that this business was his by birthright, Julian would fight. I wasn't gullible enough to believe that this was the end of it. It was just getting started. The change in the air was evident by the following morning. Eye contact was avoided by those who had smiled at me the previous week. When department chiefs spoke to me, they paused. The whispers were audible to me. I was aware of what was taking place. My father and Julian were already stoking suspicions and fabricating stories about their ties, which included former friends, board members, and top executives. I was being portrayed as aloof, cruel, and disloyal. In particular, Julian had adopted the persona of the younger brother who had been betrayed. Now I could picture him sitting in a classy restaurant, telling investors how his sister had stolen the business from him and their father, his voice full of phony melancholy. He didn't have anything to say. Only a sigh. The head was shaking gravely. "I only ever wanted the best for my children" is a gentle line. It was subtly done. It was planned. It was also risky. Because I might be expelled if they were able to turn enough people against me, particularly the board. Legally, perhaps. However, they might turn my leadership into a nightmare. I refused to allow that to occur. I convened an executive emergency meeting that afternoon. The anxiety struck me as soon as I entered the boardroom. I couldn't see half the room. The other half kept a careful eye on me, anticipating my error. I made my way to my place at the head of the table and took a seat. My voice was crisp and steady as I said, "Let's not waste time. I am aware that there have been discussions behind closed doors over whispers and drinks." I took in every face in the room, lingering on them for a moment longer than felt acceptable. Just enough to cause them to move about in their chairs. I'm not here to stifle free thought. But I'm here to take the lead. And if anyone questions my leadership, my vision, or my legitimacy to occupy this seat, speak up now or leave. One could feel the unease in the room. Some people questioned if I had what it takes to continue running my business. Some moved once more. But nobody said anything. I delicately tapped the polished table with my fingers. I said, "Let's make that clear." The screen behind me sprang to life. Performance measures, graphs, and charts, numbers that communicated a tale that no one could dispute. I've grown our business from a minor regional player to a $99 million market leader in the last 4 years. Revenue has increased by 477%. 5 new markets have been penetrated. This was not an accident. I turned to our CFO, Marcus. "Marcus, are there any financial signs that the business is having problems under my direction?" After a brief moment of hesitation, Marcus shook his head. "No. Actually, based on the data, we anticipate another 30% rise in the upcoming quarter." I gave one nod. "So let's be honest about the true situation here." With a small forward lean, I spoke steadily. "My brother and father are not upset about this company's failure. They are upset because, in spite of them, it is succeeding. They expected me to relinquish responsibility and give it to Julian, regardless of his credentials or the outcome." There was silence in the room, right up until I revealed the next truth. "Additionally, I am aware that several of you have received calls within the last 33 hours. They made offers, goodwill, incentives to pressure me into resigning. I waited for that to settle. This is your chance if you want to confess to those conversations now." More moving, uncomfortable looks. A top executive then cleared his throat. I got a call," he continued. "From your dad. He stated that he was considering making an appeal to the board." I gave a nod. "And did he provide you anything in exchange for your help?" The executive paused. Then he nodded slowly. "Yes." I stood up and exclaimed, "There it is. We shouldn't change the past. I admire the fact that my father founded this business. However, I went farther than he had ever thought possible. I refused to allow him to take external control. I lowered my voice. Sharp. He'll get a fight if he wants one." I collected my papers and stopped at the entrance to look at each executive. "Now is the time to express your opinion if you think my father and brother should have authority." Nobody made a move. Nobody said anything. "Well," I replied. And with my head held high, I left. This went beyond simply preserving what I had created. Making sure they understood that they would never take it from me again was the goal. That evening I called. To the board, no. To an investor, no. But to the press. By morning, the identical headline appeared in all of the main business outlets. Elena Hart outmaneuvers family in boardroom battle at Anderson & Company. Power shift. I had taken action. I was now anticipating theirs. My email overflowed by the next morning. Emails. Missed phone calls. Statements from board members, investors, and journalists. A few were helpful. Others were wary. However, the majority of them had the same query. Is it accurate? I didn't answer. Not quite yet. I was aware of my father's strategy. He had cultivated his reputation for decades. He realized that reputation may be just as important in the corporate world as facts. He would attempt to discredit me in public if he couldn't defeat me in the boardroom. Indeed, the counterattack, a well-crafted press release, arrived by noon. The company Anderson & Company has always been family-owned. Although we are saddened by recent events, we are steadfast in our commitment to the principles that founded our business. Changes in leadership are inevitable, and we hope the next transition goes smoothly. It was subtly done. However, I was fully aware of its intended meaning. Elena is careless. Elena is erratic. Elena doesn't work well with others. I wasn't shocked, but I was angry. I watched the news in my office while commentators broke down the story. Was Elena Hart's takeover too forceful? Will the company's future be harmed by her leadership style? Does she have a PR catastrophe from which she will never fully recover? They spoke as if I wasn't there, as if I hadn't already decided what to do next. However, I was. I was prepared to start a public conflict if that was what my father and Julian desired. I didn't make an announcement. There was no news conference that I hosted. Rather, I made a single, discreet phone call to an old investigative journalist friend. I said, I have something for you, but you'll have to move quickly. I sent over all of the paperwork, emails, financial reports, and internal data an hour later. Proof of the disaster that Anderson and Company had spent years trying to hide. Errors committed while my father was in charge. I had been quietly cleaning it up for the past 10 years. The story went live 30 hours later. A history of debt and cover UPS at Anderson and Company, behind the scenes. The article didn't mince words. It revealed the covert financial problems, gave credit to my leadership for resolving them, and made one point very evident. It was because of me that this business survived. Not my dad. Not Julian. Me. Just like that, the story changed. The board gave up questioning. Investors ceased to hesitate. And there was nowhere left for my father to hide. Finally, 3 days later, he called. Before answering, I let the phone ring 4 times. His voice was tight as he said, Elena, we must speak. I reclined in my seat. Do we? Quiet. Then a sigh. That wasn't necessary for you to do. I chuckled a little. You didn't either. This business was meant to be a legacy, he stated. For the family. For the two of you. A little, stinging pang shot through my chest. That was something I had once desired as well. However, it is no longer the case. Dad, I continued softly, you ought to have trusted me with the heritage if you wanted me to preserve it. You attempted to take it away from me instead. Another long stillness. Then slowly and almost grudgingly, he asked. Now what? I inhaled. Now I'll make sure you never have the opportunity to deal with this business again. The conflict was over. My dad had lost. Julian was no longer there. And I had prevailed. However, I had no sense of success as I sat in my office and gazed out over the skyline. No excitement. Not a party. Only a silent void. I had fought for Anderson and Company for 8 years, helping to build, protect, and improve the company. It was really mine now. However, the price. That weighed more than I anticipated. Because I had lost something else along the road. My relatives. I entered the office the following morning as if it were any other. However, everything was different now. The murmurs had ceased. The uncertainty had subsided. I was no longer viewed as merely the CEO. I was Elena Hart, the one who had seized power, outsmarted her own family, and triumphed. I was revered by some for it. I was feared by some. And some waited for me to fail in silence. I waited for them. My father and I had our final meeting in the conference room at noon. He appeared worn out. Older. Worn down. As if he had finally been overcome by the full weight of everything that had transpired. I awaited his next words. His voice was quieter than I had ever heard it when he eventually did. He declared, I am retiring. Effective immediately. I didn't respond. This was what I had anticipated. He went on, I'll sell the majority of my shares. As an investor, I will retain a small stake, but I will no longer be involved. I looked him over. And Julian? He tightened his jaw. He is no longer there. Accepted the buyout. He will not return. I had anticipated this outcome. Julian had never had the strength to stand by himself. He rushed, like he always did, as soon as he realized he had lost. Nevertheless, something inside of me changed when I heard it spoken out loud. It wasn't regret. It wasn't remorse. It was only the end. I gave a nod. Comprehensive. With a groan, my father stroked his temples as if he were suffering from a headache. After a lengthy silence, he turned to face me and said something I didn't anticipate. You were underestimated by me. There was no apology. However, it was something. It was the closest thing I would ever receive to an apology, but it wasn't one. Oddly enough, I also recognized that I no longer needed it. After a month, Anderson and Company had a totally different appearance. The members of the board who had supported Julian and my father? Lost. The executives who formerly doubted my ability to lead? Changed. The business had always prospered under my leadership, but now it was all mine. And a new direction followed that control. My father had always rejected the changes I brought about. I updated the systems he had deemed superfluous. I ventured into fields he had been too scared to venture into. I wasn't just taking the lead. I was changing. Profits soared within 8 months. We reached the $200 million milestone in less than a year. And I wasn't struggling to fit in for the first time. I was creating something that would never be taken away from me. My father and I had supper together a year after everything had finished. It was our first conversation since he retired. He appeared calmer now. Not lost. Simply at peace. Over his drink, he remarked, "I read about the latest deal you closed. Wise move." I grinned a little. "I understand." A little smile appeared on his face. We were no longer at odds with one another. No battle for dominance. No conflict. The silent truth between us only. He had attempted to ignore me, and I had shown him to be mistaken. He held up his glass. In reference to Anderson and Company. There was no hostility this time when I clinked my glass against his. No resentment. Just tranquility. Since I had already prevailed. And I knew it without his consent. I now consider the lessons I've learned from this adventure while I sit in my office and gaze out over the city where I established my empire. Family isn't always your ally. They are your rivals. Although loyalty is valuable, it is never assured. There is no transfer of power. It is earned. Stated. Captured. Furthermore, getting their approval isn't the best technique to demonstrate your value. It's by creating something so strong and indisputable that they will never be able to ignore you again. I don't regret anything. I currently own Anderson and Company. And I'll see to it that nobody forgets. Furthermore, I didn't have to yell, struggle, or plead for acceptance in the end. My work spoke for me and their betrayal was overshadowed by my silence. The finest retaliation in actuality isn't retaliation at all, but rather overcoming it, getting better, and creating something so resilient that they can never break you again. Protect your peace, establish boundaries, and put progress ahead of resentment if you've been harmed or deceived. You deserve power, not just suffering. Have you ever experienced such betrayal? Leave a comment with your tale. Together, let's communicate, get better, and climb.